Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. I think my sound quality isn't quite as good as usual, so I'm sorry. I grabbed my husband's headphones and I think they might not work, so it might be my computer recording. But if I go downstairs, my kid will see me, and I'm in a different spot, hiding from my kid, hence being in front of a weird window with the sun coming directly in. Um, yeah, that's where we are. So we're on module 4. So again, this one, and I don't know that I emphasized it quite as much as I wanted to in the module overview. So this chapter, people in class may have very different opinions about sex, sexuality, particularly reproduction, and choosing not to have children and choosing to end pregnancy. Um, the focus for this class, I don't want to be what people should be engaging in, but about the overall messages that people are receiving and about effects on mental health. So, for example, you may believe that young women should not be engaging in sex, particularly outside of a committed, perhaps marital relationship, and that's fine. Um, but the focus of your discussions with each other, I want to stay on the issues at hand about this imbalance in beliefs, because that could well carry into marriage. Even if someone is waiting for a marriage to have sex, they're still getting messages about what sex is supposed to be, and those messages may not be the most healthy messages. Um, and again, with issues like abortion, we're taking a very professional tone here. So rather than debating what we think should be legal, what we think should be whatever, um, the focus, if you want to engage at all, and it's fine to not touch on anything that is too important to you, to have that distanced conversation right now. Um, if you are discussing it, you're focused on mental health and well-being, so how it affects women, and about the research around that. Okay, so let's get going. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So there's a few main things that we're going over. We're thinking about sort of how girls and women experience their own bodies, particularly in a sexual sense, but I think that kind of has a lot to say about how we experience our bodies in general. Um, and then we think specifically about sexual activity, desire, and pleasure, sex and consent, sex education, pornography, and we look at a few different perspectives on it. And then mental health effects of abortion. And again, uh, the article I assigned is really trying to cover multiple perspectives of that. It is just one article. There's a lot of people who might disagree with the conclusions that they made or might kind of counter critique. We'll talk about that in a moment. So first, the hairless ideal. So talking about how women became, as more and more of women's bodies were exposed to public, there was more expectation of grooming and being hairless. Um, she also talks about some stereotypes about like bra burners and hairy feminists. One of the things that I really took away from this, um, and now I'm worried if I'm confusing the two. No, I think it is this one. Is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. In the sense that Basso talks about how a lot of women remove hair because they believe that others will judge them negatively if they don't. And when we do some research, that is in fact true. This is very real, that women may be judged negatively in all sorts of ways based on having more body hair than is socially acceptable. Um, she also talks about that male partners may request, suggest, or demand hairlessness. So again, this is not something that women are just kind of assuming their partners want or being sold. This is something that partners actually may be expecting or requesting. And some of this is related to pornography. And in pornography, often there is, very, very groomed or hairless genitals being presented. Um, She talked interestingly about feminism and sexual orientation, and it just a lot of sort of interesting tidbits here. Um, yeah, there I get the views of women with visible body hair. Uh, and this last part was really interesting, time and cost of hair removal. It's really expensive, even if you just think about razors, which is somewhat parallel. Men often use razors to shave their face. Excuse me, but just the time that go, particularly if you're doing more than just your legs, there's a lot of time and money and energy that goes into hair removal. I don't typically wear makeup, and even when I have, I've worn sort of minimal and fairly cheap makeup, and I try to regularly remind my husband of all the money we save because of that. Oh, I'm getting reminders about random holidays. Sorry about that. I usually remember to do that before I record. At least it wasn't a weird text. Uh, the last one that I thought was interesting was, and I don't know that I had ever heard this before, was that there are actually health risks with removing pubic hair. So the pubic hair serves a protective function, and so when you take it out, you actually, we often think of hair removal as being very sanitary, but there's risks with that. I don't know for sure how accurate it is, but I've heard that shaving underarms contributes to risk for cancer, because especially if you're using an antiperspirant deodorant. So these things actually can harm us. And then a kind of related chapter, they're both fairly short, talks about talks specifically, so specifically focused on the vulva and vagina, and then more generally, uh, and then but it goes more general than just the body hair. As a side note, I don't include illustrations in this class, but if you haven't looked up an illustration of female genitalia recently, it's probably not a bad idea to understand what we're saying when we say vulva and vagina. Um, Again, I think if I had used a traditional textbook, they may have included some of that information. I didn't, and I'm just realizing I didn't include any sources that specifically have that. Maybe I'll do differently next time. But there's often, girls' parts aren't really named as children, and many of our parts are kind of out of sight. And I don't remember seeing many detailed illustrations of these things in sex ed. I had sex ed in the rural Midwest, and so that definitely had an effect on what I learned, how I learned it, what kind of motivational speakers came to my school. Um, but at any rate, it's not a bad idea to spend a little time as we're talking about female sex and sexuality to look up female genital diagram or something like that. So yeah, that's my first point. I was totally looking at that slide before I started talking, but it's kind of just assumed that we'll know and understand what our genitals are, how to keep them healthy, all of these things, but often no one really talks about it to us or teaches us about it. Um, so and I think this is the one that said that, or no, it was one of the speakers, I think, from this week, who said that little boys will at least get something named, even if it's like a funny name like a wee wee. But little girls, you often just kind of skip right from their knees to their belly button. Um, so So the author in this chapter talks about menstruation and kind of anxieties around menstruation, hair removal, so kind of a different focus on the same topic as the last chapter, oral sex, and then the most horrifying thing, designer vaginas. I was watching trashy reality TV with my husband the other day, and I mentioned that this was a thing, and he was horrified. Um, and then, that sun is, yeah, that's not great. Let me see if I can. Yeah, that's probably better. I don't know. And then at the end, she kind of talks about efforts to reclaim sort of identity with our genitals. So she talks about genital art and also genital diversity. We're not all meant to look exactly the same. And so it's important to know that there's no one right way to have a vagina and a vulva. And then another reading from the book, Slut Shaming the Policing of Women's Sexuality. And I think one thing that was really well captured in this particular chapter is the idea. Let me see if I can turn a little bit. Yeah, I think that's probably a little bit better. So one thing that I really liked about this chapter is it captures the conflict and the idea that, we have different opinions. We all have the same goals. We want women to be able to be safe, to embrace their sexuality, and to not be unduly influenced by by outside forces on their sexuality. But we have very different views about how to accomplish that and what that means. Um, so this chapter goes through labels, and it's often not actually based on knowledge of sexual activity. It's based on the person's body, their attire, their behavior, their dating partners. So it's often not just about sex, it's about a lot of other pieces to it. And it's often used as a weapon for someone who's disliked, different, or threatening. And I really found interesting the discussion of how words like slut are used as a class distinction. Like, I'm the right kind of sexually appealing, I'm the classy sexy, whereas they are the trashy sexy. And then it gets into this kind of question of so there's a push to kind of embrace sexuality in a very public way, but there's then some kind of pushback to say, well, is that really empowerment, or is that just upholding the status quo where women's bodies are to be admired and our value comes from how physically appealing our bodies are? There's also some discussion of the sexual double standard, and it seems like it may be starting to get a little better or going away, but that's when you ask people directly. And with things like sexism, racism, we know as a society that we've decided these are bad. And so when you ask people directly, they will typically say, no, 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 no. I have very egalitarian beliefs, which is a bit of a quandary. And so a lot of research kind of tries to trick people into revealing their true thoughts. The problem there is there's a lot of pushback about, like, well, how do you know these are the true thoughts? Because we know that we can use research setups to manipulate the outcomes quite a bit. So it's really tough to get at what people truly believe. Also, people are great at telling themselves that there are different reasons for what they're doing. So they may say, oh no, like this isn't about the fact that you date around. It's, or sleep around is really what I mean. It's something else that I don't like about you, that I want to distance from you. The author McHugh talks about mental health effects of this, including so just some of the outcomes of labeling women as sluts and the treatment that goes with that. So she talks about mental health, substance use, self-harm, relationship problems. It just, words really do damage. We can say all sorts of lovely things about sticks and stones, but words do damage. And then there's a really interesting talk at the end about slut walks, feminism, and culture. So slut walks are, and it's really kind of saying we have a right to exist in public space, dressed how we want, particularly without getting raped. So part of the issue is that when someone's sexually assaulted, there's often a like, well, but what was she wearing? And you should be able to wear whatever you want and still not expect to be sexually assaulted. You should be able to be drunk in a space and still expect to not be sexually assaulted. We may do things as to increase our safety, but you can do everything right and still be sexually assaulted. And you should be able to do everything wrong and still expect to not get sexually assaulted. The issue, one of the issues that was pointed out here, and it's one that I'm familiar with, that I had read about before, slut walks assume safety and a certain measure of power. So if you go into a very conservative culture, where there are a lot of very strict rules about women's dress, and where there is kind of an expectation, a more open expectation, that if a woman is unaccompanied in public, she's fair game. You can't do the same kind of slut walk that you could do in Canada, which I think is where it started, or in the US, or another sort of very more egalitarian. The US isn't completely egalitarian, but more egalitarian and more protected. Um, and there's also kind of a white piece to this. I have a quote here from McHugh. Groups of women whose bodies have been viewed as erotic, sexualized, and rapeable. And that speaks back to particularly Black women who were enslaved, but other women who have been viewed as um, very much objects and property. Um, and so, sort of doing a public display of dressing provocatively may feel very different for groups who have experienced that. Abortion and mental health. So this is in the American Psychologist. That is the journal for the American Psychological Association. It is one of the hardest to get in journals in psychology. They try to really publish things that are very influential in the field, very high quality. It's based on a task force done by the APA, and I'm sure they took a period of several years to do it. They're also not unbiased. There is no such thing as an unbiased source. They looked at the literature as a whole. So the whole issue is that there is a lot of literature suggesting that there is no negative outcome from abortion, and a lot of literature saying that there is, to the point that some people have labeled it post-abortion syndrome. This, huge sense of guilt and regret and all sorts of feelings that may set in even years after an abortion. And some studies make it seem like it is quite prominent, that most women who receive an abortion experience it. But you have to think about who the sample is, whether it's a true random sample. And often if I participate in studies that I'm motivated to participate in. So if I have had an abortion and I feel like it just was a thing that happened once, just like I once got some moles removed from my back, and it was scary at the time, and then I kind of moved on. I might see stuff about abortion and really it just doesn't faze me, and not choose to participate. On the other hand, if I had an abortion and either immediately or years later it set in that I have done this thing that can never be undone, and I feel awful about it, and I miss the child that I didn't have, and it just, eats me up at night, and I see something about abortion, I'm much more likely to participate. So when we think about samples, we really have to think about motivated participants and who's going to, you have to think about how this sample is being distributed, or how the information is being distributed, like how are you recruiting your participants? And then among the people who see the message, who is more likely to participate? So if I'm collecting data and I only use mailing lists from self-help groups for women who regret their abortions, of course I'm going to see a message of lots of women regretting their abortions. So this is part of what, there's a lot of things that make abortion research really difficult. Other issues are often women choose an abortion for a reason. And so I think I mentioned at the overview, so if someone's having an abortion, most likely it was an unplanned pregnancy, but it was also likely an unwanted pregnancy. And there's a difference between unplanned and unwanted. It could be like, oh, I didn't plan for this, but once I get over the initial shock, I may feel a little overwhelmed, but I'm also kind of excited. Whereas unwanted may feel very, very differently. And unwanted could be for a lot of reasons. It could be with a partner that you are trying to leave. And might be, you're going to be at least legally connected to and potentially financially dependent on this person if you have the child. It could be a product of rape and or incest. It could be that you have some health conditions that would make this pregnancy difficult, and you just don't want to risk your own health and well-being. It could be that you have goals coming up that are not compatible with having a child, or even just having the pregnancy. It could be that you already have a lot of children and are strapped for cash and can't imagine managing another one on top. So there's a lot of different reasons that a pregnancy may be unwanted. There's also another category which is very much wanted, but medically just not feasible, which is a ridiculously painful experience that I'm not really going to even get into here. To me, that is a different category, and that is the vast majority of late-term abortions are those, potentially very wanted, but medically not viable. And we may have very different views about what to do in that situation, but what I want you to see is that it's a different set of emotions and decision making than unplanned and unwanted. So with abortion, we're really thinking not just of unplanned, but particularly of unwanted children. And so it's important when we compare outcomes, because some studies will say, because there's still a lot of hormones involved when you have an abortion. And part of what puts women at such high risk for depression after they've had a child is these hormones. And there's a lot of pieces that put them at risk, but the hormones definitely play a role. So, sometimes they'll do studies of women who had a child versus were pregnant but had an abortion. But again, there's reasons to think that the women who chose to have their children might have more social support, might have more finances, might be more excited about the child in general. And they may not have as many difficult things happening in their lives. Sorry, I can hear my husband and my kid downstairs, and it's distracting. So we have a lot of reasons to think that these groups are different. So the article in the American Psychologist by Major et al., the first thing they really emphasized was that there's a lot of methodological problems. And in psychology, all studies are flawed. You cannot have a perfect study because if you study one particular group in depth, you're missing the breadth. If you are studying a big group, you might be missing some of the smaller differences between them. Just by definition, you can't have one perfect study. But some are more flawed than others. And it's important to think that a flawed study, the more flawed your study is, the less trustworthy the results from that study are. Because there's so much variety in the quality of the research, they couldn't do a traditional meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a statistical approach where you're kind of bringing in the data from the findings from lots of articles and kind of mashing them together using science and magic. They couldn't really do that here. And also, just to acknowledge, I think it's impossible to interpret these things without bias. It is impossible to completely set our bias aside, but our goal as a professional is always to do that as much as possible. So overall, they found that there were no differences in mental health among U.S. women who had had an abortion versus not had an abortion. There's a few issues that they considered. One is thinking about the psychological responses. So you may see an effect after an abortion, but what they're saying is it's not more than what we're seeing in similar women who went on to have a pregnancy. I forget if some of the studies may have also looked at naturally occurring miscarriages. a big thing that they pointed out was a diversity of experiences. So just because women in general aren't having mental health effects doesn't mean a particular woman won't have negative health effects. Um, but it may not, it's what we can say is it's not automatic when you have an abortion, uh, particularly if someone is being coerced into having an abortion, or if someone would really, really like to have the child but does not believe that there are resources available to have the child. So you might say societally coerced because there's not services available. Um, I would imagine that that person would have a much more difficult time because it may be a wanted but still just not seeming viable option. Um, so distinguishing unplanned and unwanted, that's something I've talked about a few different times already. Uh, and thinking about the financial, emotional, and physical ability to cope with the pregnancy. So when you factor in all of those things and look at similar outcomes or at outcomes for similar women who had you know, carried the child to term, had the baby, um, you don't see as many differences. So they talk about their four perspectives, and this is what they go over at the part that I tell you to start reading at the summary and conclusions. Uh, and so they say, with the exception of the first one, these perspectives are complementary, emphasizing different factors that may lead to negative or positive psychological reactions following termination of a pregnancy. Um, so there's one out. Do I have a second slide on this one? No, I don't. I think these are written very clearly and easy to interpret for yourself. But essentially, there's one main perspective in the literature that this is a negative outcome. And then there's other major perspectives that all, it could be all of them, or it could be, some of them in some situations and others and others. So they identified four main themes, only one of which kind of goes against the grain of the rest. So again, I know I say this a lot, but I really want to keep us focused here. If you want to discuss things from this article, focus on issues of methodology if you'd like to kind of explore that a little bit, but also really stay focused on not whether it's right, not whether it should be legal, whether it should be more accessible, less accessible. Focus on the mental health outcomes for women. This next one, what young women believe about their own sexual pleasure. So this is talking about sort of women's beliefs about their bodies, about sex, about what's okay, and it's going beyond consent. So often with sex education, we talk about consent. We kind of talk about knowledge of how to prevent pregnancy and infections, but we don't talk a lot about having positive sexual experiences. It was really interesting because I just heard a lot of bangs, but everything seems okay. So it's part of it is when you ask girls about their positive sexual experiences and ask them to explain it, a lot of them were just saying, like, oh, it's a good sexual experience if it doesn't hurt. That's a really low bar. And I thought this term was fascinating. The psychological clitoridectomy. So I don't think I cover it in this class. Female genital mutilation. But it's a practice coming out of. It's not native to the U.S. There are people here doing it, but it's a practice of removing the clitoris in typically girlhood or around puberty, and the thought is that it restrains women's sexual activity because it removes the pleasure, because they're removing most of where women experience pleasure during sex. And it's often something that's very repellent, and I would say rightfully so, to people in the US, but there is still a lot of cultural messages that still say sex is not about women to enjoy, it's not about women's enjoyment. So I already mentioned the issue of childhood naming, that we don't really talk with girls about their genitals. But even textbooks often kind of drop out a little bit here. And to some extent, it's because textbooks want to sell to everybody, and so they try to go with the most conservative approach. Um, they also talk about the myth of physical virginity, which is a big issue. Um, there is no way to tell whether a woman has had sex or not before, just like with men. There are lots of things that can affect our physical anatomy. Um, yeah, but for so long, it's been believed that you could tell whether a woman was a virgin or not. And my heart aches for everyone who faced very real social consequences because of that. And then she ends with the idea of how helpful it can be to discuss sexual health and pleasure early. Um, and that's another thing that's controversial because you know, people may be afraid of sending the message that sex is fun and you should go start doing it right now to middle school or younger children. Um, but also, information is so freely available now that if they don't learn from a good source early on, they may not learn until you're ready to tell them, but there's a good likelihood that they're going to be learning from other sources. Um, so I think it's very important for children to have accurate sources of developmentally appropriate information. Some of the best tips I've heard are to kind of start with a book, and for any sensitive topic, to ask kids if they have any questions. And when they do ask a question, though, to give the least information possible to answer. So you want to answer that question, but to answer only that question, but to still keep the dialogue open. So, kind of sending the idea that I will answer as many questions as you have, but I'm going to do them one at a time. Um, and I thought it was really interesting, the idea of discussing specifically sexual pleasure, because I don't know that I would have thought to do that either. Um, yeah. This next talk, the I forget the full name of it, but the truth about women's sexuality. She talks here about specifically medical understanding of women's, even our basic anatomy, um, but also of sort of our desires and what's pleasurable. And I loved when she said they could have just asked women. Um, but yeah, understanding of women's, even just, like I said, even just basic anatomy has been very unclear for a very long time and is still unclear. Um, so even things like, and I think this gets to the idea, we'll talk about it a lot more when we talk about health, but when we treat men and malehood as the norm, women are seen, healthy variations on womanhood are seen as abnormal. So, for example, the clitoris was often seen as an abnormal growth or a sign that someone was a hermaphrodite, so that someone was not clearly female, they had a mix of female and male genitals. And even now, the clitoris is often considered not that important. And sex ed, even that, again, I'm from the rural Midwest, I sadly understand that. But even being left out of medical texts, it's just seen as so not important to the functioning of the body. And I can't imagine the same being said as a man's penis or testicles. I just can't imagine them saying, it's really not essential to their functioning. We don't need to worry about it. We're working on saving their life. Um, or we're working on fixing some other issue. We don't really need to take care of that. And I think she talks in a compelling way about sex as being connected with the body, feeling whole, and she kind of touches on experiences for survivors of trauma. Oh, I forgot to. Oh, I thought that I had updated all of these, and I did not. I guess this one's going to be a two-parter then, because I will not be able to do it all by memory. Thanks. Bye.